Good afternoon, everybody. I'm so glad to see we have a terrific audience today, as we usually do, but today is a special day for us. First of all, it's I think the third annual inaugural seminar for the Covering Environment Seminar Series of SEAC. And it's a special day on top of that because we have a very distinguished speaker who made the trek all the way from across campus to our facility here. And on top of that, he is a trilateral dean of the colleges of art and letters and science. He runs the Biosphere facility, which I'm sure all of you have heard about. And he injected an enormous amount of enthusiasm, commitment, and stimulation of research in that facility, which in its early days had a kind of a checkered reputation. Those of you who don't know that, catch me some other time and I'll tell you the story, because I used to know several of the people who went into the enclosure originally. But in any case, Dr. Ruiz is going to tell us about his work, which encompasses the College of Science, Biosphere 2, SEAC, in new initiatives which take all of the expertise from these various units at the university and merge them and focus them in Biosphere 2 and possibly other places to take advantage of the expertise that we have across campus. So he's truly an ambassador for the University of Arizona. In fact, I coined the term that I hope appears now on your stationery, the Renaissance Dean of the University of Arizona. So here he is, Joaquin Ruiz.
Thank you very much, Raf. This is wonderful, and I'm really pleased to be here. But in fact, if you want to know my real title, I'm on the 10th floor of the Gould-Simpson building, and all of a sudden, for some reason, central administration decided that we had to have all kinds of signs everywhere, including in inside rooms, because if there's a fire, you should know where you're at, or something of the sort. So I told them that I'd be happy to put a sign in my door if it said El Jefe, which they put. So now that's what I am. And the way I sold that is I said, well, you have at last 50% chance that when I retire, you won't have to change the sign because it has no name, right? So anyway, it's a real honor to be here because, in fact, the most exciting thing I've done in the University of Arizona as dean, and probably some of the most interesting and exciting things I've done even as a scientist, has been operating the Biosphere 2. And most of you probably know that the birth, or a lot of the energy and ideas for the Biosphere 2 came from what was probably the progenitor of this organization, which was the Earth environmental system that was by the airport with Carl Hodges. Right. So Carl actually was one of the folks that actually tried to make the Biosphere operate at the beginning. And what I want to do today is in fact go a little bit through the history of the Biosphere for two reasons. One of them is because, talk about a controlled environmental system, that's what it was supposed to be since day one. And some of the reasons why it didn't work as well as people thought it was going to work, and where we are today with it, and where I hope to go in the future with Biosphere 2. And I hope you find it sort of interesting. So let me see now. Yep. So about 25 years ago, probably about 30 years ago, a bunch of freethinkers, I can't think of a better name than that. Some of them were National Academy of Science members. Some of them were, at the Smithsonian. Were very interested in understanding how the Earth worked before I think the term Earth systems was even coined. But in those days, there was an important hypothesis that had been sort of thrown out there by a chemist and a microbiologist called the Gaia hypothesis, which tried to explain how the living organisms in the Earth were part of what controlled the Earth as an inorganic system. So it was a living system. These folks, Lovejoy and Margulis, got into big battles with evolutionary biologists because evolutionary biologists thought that what these people meant was that evolution had a purpose, which is nothing, that's not what they meant. But anyway, and these free thinkers, which among them had somebody with a ton of money at Bass, used to meet in France, and they used to meet in a ship, and they used to meet in Australia, and everywhere they were trying to understand these parts of the system, these biomes, which is what they call. And then sooner or later, they recognized or they realized that there was no way that they were really going to be able to answer the questions that they wanted to answer without having an apparatus that they could use where they could do some experimentation and observation with a bit of control. And that's how the biosphere was born. My understanding from Ed is that the original sort of back of the envelope calculation was that the biosphere was going to cost about $30 million to be built. In the end, they missed it by a zero. And the thing, although nobody really seems to know exactly how much, it's about $300 million, and that was 25 years ago. Today, this would be $1 billion to build. But the point, I think that the point of the first part of the history of the biosphere was that you do have to be sort of visionary, and sometimes that's sort of, some of these visionaries were a little cuckoo, but you have to be visionary and you have to be aggressive with what you're trying to address. Of course, everybody here knows that it's called Biosphere 2 because Biosphere 1 is where we live. And when the biosphere was built, there was an enormous amount of engineering technology that was sort of invented and developed. The airframe was something that was extraordinary. When it was first sealed, the airframe was leaking less than the shuttle when it was actually flying. So this thing really had no leakage. The whole thing is sitting in a tub of stainless steel. This is 3.14 acres on stainless steel, so that there would be no interaction between the soil and the stuff in the biosphere itself. So the idea was really that they would have a sealed thing, and then you get into the issue of whether it was really a replica of Biosphere 1 or a model of Biosphere 1, but they just wanted to observe as best as they could how these biomes actually interacted with each other. The biomes that they chose, there's a mangrove, there's an ocean, there's a rainforest, there's a desert, and then there was an enormous operation that actually had where biospheres were going to actually grow food. The mission of the biospherians came in, and this is all conversations with Ed. I wasn't part of any of this at the beginning. I've been involved with the biosphere for only about 10 years. But Ed was what most modern philanthropists are. So he was ahead of the game even with philanthropy. And his view was that this thing should self-sustain itself. So there should be sustainability. And how would something like this sustain itself? If you produce the intellectual property to colonize other planets. Right? So their idea was that they would basically have enough information and enough stuff that if they needed to go to the moon, they would have all the information required for that. And the grand challenge that they presented themselves was that the thing would control itself such that you would not need to actually exchange mass at all, just energy. In other words, people wouldn't have to go up with truckloads of oxygen or figure out how to scrub the CO2. And the only thing you would have to do of some miniaturization of this or this was in the moon was have a little nuclear reactor on the side so that it would have the energy. And that meant that they really had to understand Earth systems and how all of this was going to operate to control the atmosphere in particular. The challenges that they had since day one, and they recognized that there were big challenges, is that the glass that covered the whole thing was going to cut down the UVA, the UVB, and whatever you need that needs UVA and UVB, well, you're screwed. It didn't have that. And that had consequences, in fact, with growing food. The other thing that happened, which was the unexpected part of the whole thing, the thing that actually made it not work at all, was that they did not understand fully how soils work. And what happened was that the soils that they had at the biosphere did not produce enough CO2 that then would dissociate to produce oxygen. So the oxygen concentration in the biosphere actually dropped from whatever the value is here. I mean, at sea level it's 21%, but it dropped to about 10% in 1 year. So these folks were actually living at about 10,000 feet elevation right off the bat. And that was not very good. The other thing that happened was that they were growing all this food, whatever little they were able to grow, because they were never able to grow enough food to give them the caloric intake that they needed. So they didn't end up with scurvy or any of this stuff because they had enough vitamins and whatnot, but the calories were a big issue. So they were all skinny, they were all grumpy by the time, well, by the time they came out, they were all sort of half nuts because they were not, they couldn't breathe. The breathing was an issue. The concentrations of nitrous oxides in the atmosphere were nuts because of all the stuff they were trying to grow. So the atmosphere was a bit poisonous, and they weren't getting along. So somebody should have actually done Big Brother there, and the University of Arizona would be rich, but nobody thought about that then. So that's the biosphere. That's sort of very quickly the story of the biosphere. But let me just sort of here point out, and again, I apologize for those that have been there, but now seeing it from the top, this is the rainforest that's in here. There's an ocean in here. There's a mangrove sort of stuck in the middle here, and then there's a desert. This is where the biospherians lived. So this is like Motel 6. And this thing that looks like hangars is where they actually were trying to grow food. These two sort of semicircle things here are another engineering marvel. When they figured out that they had this sealed operation in the middle of the desert, and that in the middle of a hot summer, the pressure of the pressure inside of the biosphere could be such that it would blow the windows out. And at night, when it cools off, they could actually implode. So what they built were these things called the lungs, and they're connected to the biosphere by these tunnels underneath. It's a variable volume chamber that has a 20-ton aluminum plate that goes up and down. So the pressure differential that would happen inside of the biosphere is taken over by the volume change in these two lungs. Really sort of very clever, actually. And if somebody takes a tour, and if anybody wants to have a modern tour, I'd be more than happy to show you. Today, you can see the amazing thing about it is you go to one of the lungs. The other one is a bit sort of a mess. But if you go to one of the lungs, the rubber and the aluminum and everything else is in great shape. I mean, so the materials that they used, the redundancy in the materials that they used was quite extraordinary. So what you see over here as well is this village. That's what we call it. And there are a bunch of houses, really, which were dorms that were created by Columbia University, which is sort of the second owner of the biosphere. You want to think about it that way. When I took over the biosphere, I kept telling everybody I felt like Elizabeth Taylor. I was a seventh husband. But so the biosphere has had a variety of folks that have actually taken a shot at it. But when Columbia took over the biosphere, and I'll say why in a minute, one of the things that they had is they had like an Earth semester abroad, because of course we're sort of west of the Hudson, so it would be abroad. And they would charge like $50,000 a semester for the students that came here. In fact, and a lot of the climate, global climate folks that you hear in radio and whatnot, probably actually had a shot at getting a degree at or classes here, because there was an environmental program with policy, classic sort of Columbia operation. It was terrific. And of course, if they're charging $50,000, you can't live in tents. So Columbia built this thing at a cost of about $10 million. Which what we now do and what we want to do, and this is where all of you can really help me, we use it right now as a conference center, which is sort of terrific because you're in the middle of nowhere, looking at an icon of possibilities, and looking at the other side of the Catalinas, which is some of the most extraordinary scenery in southern Arizona. But I want this to be way more than a conference center. I want this to be an institute that transmits to the world what the University of Arizona is all about in the environment. Okay? So at the moment, the latest that I'm trying to maneuver is that the Aspen Institute will have a winter Aspen Institute on the environment at the Biosphere, as an example. Okay? But if you have a better idea, just tell me. Right now, it's the perfect time because we have a master plan on the Biosphere. The master plan was first asked to be created so that we could have a better experience for the tourists to come to see the Biosphere. We get about 100,000 people. And my hope is that if you get 100,000 people to show at the Biosphere, that they come out at least with 3 observations that make them more educated. And right now, I think that all they get out of their experience is, holy smokes, who created this thing? You know, kind of stuff, because it's sort of amazing. But we should have 3 points, and we should have that kind of thinking of how are we educating these folks that come over. So the master plan is about that and so on. But the people that are creating the master plan have sort of changed what this is all about, and they want to push, again, they also came up with the idea of pushing the Biosphere as a place that is the center of the intellectual center about something about the environment. And what they're pushing for, and you'll love all this, they're pushing that this place should be the place that is understood and known to be the headquarters of school gardens. And that we can actually then have, because there's school gardens everywhere in the country, but it's not an organized kind of thing. Well, maybe you can start organizing that and make it a better operation. That's just an idea, but you can see that right now everything is sort of bubbling, and we're trying to figure out what would be the best and coolest thing to do. Okay, so I think I've already described all of this, and I'm just going to go to the next one. I've already pointed out that there's a rainforest and an ocean, a savanna, marsh, a desert. And then now we have this thing called LEO, which I'll describe to you in a minute. It's the most important institutional experiment at the moment that we have at the Biosphere. When Ed Bass came to me, the story is actually quite interesting. The first operation, of course, was Ed Bass and the Biospherians. And if you really want to hear about funky stuff, the person that kicked out the Biospherians was Steve Bannon. So there you go. So the history there is actually sort of wild. He came in with the marshals and kicked them all out. So that's just food for thought. But and I have not met Steve Bannon, by the way. But when Columbia took over, they did some amazing experiments, which I'll describe in a minute. And the only reason that Columbia left the Biosphere was because they left. There was a president that changed at Columbia. And the president that took over was a lawyer, president of Michigan, Bollinger, and he was way more interested in social justice in Harlem than some experiment going on in the middle of the desert. And the other person that was quite involved in all of this was Michael Crow, who was vice president of research at Columbia at the time. And Michael Crow came to ASU. They got a new president, and when presidents of universities show up, they basically want to have their own thing. So they stopped working at the Biosphere, and that's when Ed Bass came to me for a variety of reasons, and he asked if we were interested to run the Biosphere. And the first question that I asked my scientists, and those scientists include people from ag and people from science, was can we do an experiment at the Biosphere that cannot be done anywhere else? And if the answer to that was yes, then sure. And if the answer to that was no, it was too much of a headache. And the answer that they came up with was a thing called the Landscape Evolution Observatory, which is, simply put, mass balance of water in semi-arid environments as global climate change progresses. So I'll show you the experiment in a second, and I'll say more about that. But the beauty of that, and something that the Biosphere allows you to do, is do interdisciplinary research in a way that cannot be done or is difficult to do in other places. So the experiment was invented by hydrologists, ecologists, geoscientist, soil and water scientist, and an atmospheric scientist. And the experiment that they created was an experiment that informed all of those disciplines of something that was quite important to each one of them, but on their own they were not going to be able to do it. Okay, so the scale of the experimentation that you can do in here is really what the biosphere is all about. Okay, well there they go, right? They're the biospherians, and this is where they were growing food, and that's pointing out that the oxygen dropped quickly. There they're saying hello. And this is through time, how the oxygen inside of the biosphere just dropped to about 14%. I said 10, but it was 14. And now, I mean, what these folks were trying to do in 25 years ago is all of a sudden in the front page of newspapers and also in movies, because NASA's all of a sudden decided that they really do want to go to Mars and put somebody on Mars. And the challenge, of course, of putting somebody on Mars is that it does take 6 months to get there. I mean, they're huge challenges. I mean, the biggest challenge is that how are you going to protect the people between here and there on cosmic radiation? I'm not exactly sure. But then after you get up there, you have to find a way that you can eat. And the Martian was all about that. And of course, here's Matt Damon trying to grow potatoes. And my good friend Gene Giacomelli immediately pointed out that that's bullshit because there's not enough light. But in the movies, it doesn't matter. So, and that's what controlled environments are all about, right? I'm trying to understand. And of course, with LEDs, where you can actually choose a wavelength of the day, you can actually do a fair amount of stuff that you couldn't do even 25 years ago. This is what the biospherians, this is the amount of space that in those days people thought it would take to actually feed 8 people. Okay? That's a really important topic. This is a third of the biosphere, kind of. And as I pointed out already, they didn't do very well on that. And we're now negotiating the possibility of having like 12 people and whether we can actually find a way of feeding 12 people for a year inside the biosphere. It goes back to the original kind of thing in the biosphere. And we're having conversations with people that talk about using bugs. I come from Mexico, so using bugs sounds like delicious. Not a problem at all. But it's, and you certainly can get a lot of protein. Somebody in here I just met about mushrooms. So I'd love to talk to you about that because this experiment may actually happen, and in a few probably weeks we may find out if that's going to go ahead or not. So that's what it takes. And when the original experiment was stopped, and sadly the narrative is that the experiment failed, and I'm trying to change that narrative because the experiment didn't fail. The experiment just didn't work the way we thought it was going to work. And as a scientist, everybody in this room knows that you only learn in science what your experiments fail. I mean, if your experiment works, that means that you've only sort of shown that what you had in your mind was right. And only failed experiments are the ones that really transform the way you think and move science forward. So when the Biosphereans left, and this was like in around here, the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere was about 360, a little bit less than 360 ppm CO2. Today, the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere is more than 400. But what Columbia did is they changed the paradigm of what they wanted to do with a biosphere and not have an entity that controlled itself, but more try to understand what was going to happen to all these biomes as CO2 went up. So the most extraordinary experiment that they did, or the experiment of note, I should say, was in the ocean, where they cranked up the CO2 to about 400 ppm, and the ocean acidified, and the corals all died. So if you go to the biosphere today, our ocean has dead corals and some frankenfish from 25 years ago that are still surviving somehow. But the corals died. And that article that was written by Columbia researchers was published again in the New Yorker about 5 years ago. And the importance of that research is that today, as all of these corals around the world are bleaching, there's a huge debate still about whether that's because of temperature, because the ocean is warming up, because of the acidification based on CO2, or because of pollution. And if anything can be said about this experiment, is that the acidification is good enough, so that the temperature increase and the pollution is just sort of cream on top of the tacos. But the acidification on its own can do it. Okay. And what Columbia was doing was exactly what the beauty of the biosphere is all about. The scale of the operations that you can, of the research that you can do is unequal. There's no ocean this size anywhere, even today. And in fact, we're just beginning to get in cahoots with folks from Hawaii, in which they're looking at genetically engineered corals that will survive warmer temperatures and lower acidities. And they can't go out and put them out in the ocean in Hawaii, but they can put them in here. And if we get huge leaks, well, it doesn't matter. It leaks into the desert, right? So, and there is no other place with this size ocean anywhere. So the scale of the biosphere is what makes it still interesting. So this goes what I've just said about the experiment. The other experiment that they did the same thing in the rainforest, and they were able to show that above 600 ppm CO2, the rainforest did not become an infinite sink of CO2, but it quit taking CO2. The physiology of the plants were whacked out, and they actually started emitting greenhouse gases. Okay. So the first order observation is that the rainforests are not an infinite sink of CO2. And they also learned a whole lot of stuff about how plants work, because you don't have wind blowing through it. You can measure what's happening in your leaves and whatnot. Okay, you can do all kinds of things, and you can read what the results are. Okay, so going back to what is the thing that we can use in the biosphere that makes it unique? It's clearly its scaling. Just like in any other science, you know, in physics, which is sort of the classic, if you go really tiny, the world behaves in a quantum way. And if you don't go really tiny, it behaves in classical Newtonian way. So things behave differently as a function of scale. And the observations are very different. So that if you are actually an ecologist that's out there putzing around in the Catalinas, and you talk to an ecologist that's you know, doing ecology in these fancy flower pots, it's like two different planets. And what you have is a biosphere in the middle that has a scale that actually allows these people to talk to each other. Okay. So the experiment that I mentioned was this thing called the Landscape Evolution Observatory. The scale, even with this guy standing there, is hard to envision. But we have these three, some people call them ski slopes, but they're not. They're a first order. They're supposed to be a watershed. And this watershed has basalt, which we brought in from Flagstaff, and if you went below this stuff, you have this thing instrumented like crazy. So we can measure everything that's happening in this system. And the first thing, and then what we do is you can see these little things here. We rain on the Landscape Evolution Observatory, and we're going to observe one. All these hydrologic models that hydrologists have been using forever, and they've never been able to test because there's never been anything like this. They're testing hydrology models. We're also testing how soil is formed, how the soil changes the chemistry of the water. And after all of that is done, we're going to actually put plants in there to see how it actually changes the hydrologic system. So to say in a different way what this experiment is all about is in the following. If you look at Tucson and you look at the ecology of Tucson, it requires about 11 inches of rain a year but as importantly, it requires rain in the monsoon season and in the winter. Okay? If we rain 20 inches a year, but it doesn't rain in the winter, which is likely going to happen as global climate change progresses because the jet stream is just going to go north, then our ecology is going to change. Our beautiful ecology is going to change. And we don't really know because atmospheric scientists have a hard time trying to really measure it, but they believe that about 20 to 25% of the humidity in the atmosphere around here is because of evapotranspiration of plants, these plants. If you change these plants to grass, it's going to be very different. That in itself then drives different kind of climate and different kind of system altogether. And how much water is actually going to be going down in the subsurface and how much is going to run off. So when I talk about mass balance of water in semi-arid environments, that's the questions that we're addressing here. We have a couple of papers that have already been published. The first, and some observations that are really cool. This is basalt, and the first time that we rained on the basalt, it sucked up all the CO2. The reactions from the minerals in the basalt were incredible. And there are scientists that are thinking that one of the ways that you can sequester CO2 from the atmosphere is pumping it in places that are full of basalt like Iceland, because the reactions in the rock itself will basically suck up the CO2. Well, we saw that in spades the first time that we actually rained on this thing. And this whole thing is actually on scales that we can actually measure the weight of it so that we know exactly how much water is in it. And we have 3 of them, so we triplicated the experiment, which again shows another interesting sort of psychological thing or cultural thing. The physical scientists, the hydrologists, geoscientists, atmospheric scientists, were happy enough by duplicating the experiment so that they could, they could say that the experiment, seen it twice. And the ecologists just said, no way. If we don't do it in triplicate, we can't publish a thing. So I had to spend $2 million more to build them one of these things so that they could play with us. But the ecology is actually quite important. Okay. So that's the thing. And what are we doing now? Okay. So what we're trying to do when I said the grand challenges, in my view, some of the grand challenges are environmental still. So as I pointed out, we are now getting in cahoots with people from Hawaii. I think Paul Allen is interested in funding the research. Mars Corporation is interested in funding the research so that we can actually try to understand how to save the corals around the world. That's number one. Joost here has been involved in the rainforest and just trying to understand how much can you beat up on a rainforest? How much can you, before you kill it? In other words, we can crank up the temperature, we can stop raining on it, and we can see how it actually, where it starts changing, where it takes water from the leaves and the roots, because everything is incredibly well plumbed. So in the rainforest, we're interested in trying to understand how much we can actually, how much stress a rainforest can have before it actually dies. The third thing, which I know nothing about, but I'm fascinated about, is food, right? That's what you guys come in. And the original sort of issues that Carl Hodges was interested in the biosphere. Food. So I don't exactly know how I met this gentleman here, but it was a good day. And what you see him in here with is a replica of the lunar greenhouse, which we have up there, which right now, because it is a replica, and Phil, I think it's your operation, it's really just to show the tourists what can be done and what's going on in the South Pole, for example. But so food is something that interests me a lot. And then what happened is, let me see if it's the next one. And what came from that is the idea that in one of these lungs, we could actually then get partner with an organization. In this case, it was Civic Farms, and that you could have a vertical farming in there, which was truly a production vertical farm. The idea was that the produce that was going to be coming out of here was going to be sold in Tucson and in Phoenix and places like Whole Foods or whatever. I mean, that was their business. But what it would allow us to do is do research in it, mostly lighting, I think, and also educate people like to be farmers in communities like ours and other places. So right now this is on hold, but it's something that I'm still quite interested in pursuing. So it may be that that we want to diminish the scale and do some further research. But whatever the case may be, the interest in food and in a controlled environment is something that I think the biosphere needs to be engaged in. These are just sort of cartoons of how it was going to work. These are the trays that they were going to use, and the area where the people that are coming out from the tourists were going to visit. And this is research. So we went pretty far in where it was going to go, and this is where it was going to look like. Another example of food has been with geography, and everybody here, I guess, knows Gary Nabum, too. He's not in geography, but he's at the UofA. And what he's quite interested is in a thing called agrivoltaics, and I'm not sure if you've ever heard about this, but it's really pretty cool. And we have a whole field there now trying to understand how this works. And very simply, what it is you have solar panels producing electricity, and underneath the solar panels you grow food. And the evapotranspiration of the food actually cools the panels enough that the electrical yield becomes higher, because these panels, as they warm up, the yield just goes down the tubes. And the other thing that it does is that because you actually have these things in the shade, they use less water. So this sort of thing about the nexus of water, energy, and food, agrivoltaics just sort of explains it better than anything else. And we had an unfortunate experiment in which the watering system for this whole thing went dead for a weekend. And the only plants that survived were the ones that were underneath, that were in the shade, and the other ones all died. So immediately you can see how that works. So those are the kinds of things. Oops, I think I'm going the other way. No, those are the kinds of things that we're working on now. And I'm going to quit there because that's where we are. So I think what I want to keep you, what I want all of you to keep in mind is that the biosphere allows for, in my view, for three things. The first one is to do experimentation that can't be done anywhere else, either because of the scale or because of the control that you can actually have in there. And of course, there are issues that are very complicated. You still have the glass issue with it not cutting with the UVA and the UVB, but if you do things like vertical farms, that's irrelevant. But if you want to do anything else, that's not irrelevant. But one is the experiments that can be done. Two, they're at scale. So we're interested in the environment, we're interested in food. And three, that it's an amazing place to educate the world about the possibilities and the environmental research that's being done here at the UofA. And when I talk about the environmental research, I'm talking, of course, about food as well. Thank you very much.
I just wanted to mention before we open up for Q&A that Gary Nabum is in fact going to be the last speaker of this semester here. So it'll keep you coming back because he has a very, very exciting, interesting story to tell. Okay, questions? Yes, Jack?
With Phil Sadler here, and as you know, Phil has been the builder of the South Pole and a number of the other construction projects that you've mentioned. And as far as taking where you are sequentially such that it's cost-effective and productive in different ways, I'm visualizing perhaps an 8-week course, and now that Amazon has bought Whole Foods, there's an interest there that can be nurtured very rapidly as far as I would see it. And the modules would go, here's 2 weeks that you're on Earth. And here's 2 weeks where we simulate you're on the South Pole. And here's another 2 weeks where we simulate that you're on Mars and you have to survive. And then the lovely lady who was in the biosphere who now is working on the balloon that goes up to the upper atmosphere and maybe early troposphere. Incorporate that as another 2 weeks such that it's using the education process as a evolution toward next phases of research. Maybe Phil could add his comments.
Well, yeah, you know, I've been to a lot of good analogs for Mars. I've been to the dry valleys of McMurdo. I've been all the way across the Canadian Arctic, up near Houghton Crater and stuff. And I believe that the best analog could be in one of those lungs, because you could make it any kind of environment you want, and you could put people in there. You know, the biosphere has a history of locking people up, you know, and so you could have people in there for 2 weeks. It would really help the engineering of the future habitat if you could take the engineers and say, okay, here's 2 weeks, you're going to be in here, you know, and learn what you can from it, and I think it'd be a real good deal.
No, I mean, Phil and I have had lots of conversations. The issue, and maybe I just have been lazy about it, but I more and more think that what he's talking about is right, and the question would be to find the source of the funding for it to get it done. I'm quite interested in it. I think that that's right. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm kind of interested in the selection of the biomes within the biosphere, and it seems like there was going to be some sort of challenge initially, and they probably envisioned the challenge that will this thing work and will it won't? Will it be productive enough?
Yeah.
And so I'm kind of interested in why there was the selection of a desert as part of the one of the biomes, because one doesn't really associate the desert with high productivity.
Yeah.
So what was?
I have no idea. Joost, do you know why they chose a desert? I don't know. That's right.
So they came from a very holistic viewpoint, and to maximize biodiversity, you go to all the world's different biomes and get plants and species from that. That's my only take on that.
Yeah, I have no idea, but it doesn't make any sense, and in fact, even now we have no clue what to do with it. Now, one of the beautiful things that has happened when Columbia ran the biosphere, they were leasing it from Bass, and just like anybody that rents an apartment, there's a contract in there that you have to leave it the way that you got it. So they couldn't actually change these. I mean, they screwed up the ocean, but they didn't turn it into a desert, and they didn't go to the food place and turn it into a landscape evolution observatory. We own it, right? It's a big difference. So we can do whatever we want with it, which has two important components. One is that we can change these biomes, and I want to take the desert and change all that biome into food production in some way or another. We're having debates, and maybe we're having those debates with the wrong people. Maybe it should be with you folks. But the idea is whether we should be looking at side-to-side modern kind of growth through like vertical farms next to native seeds kind of operations, right? Or whatever. But we're struggling with what to do with it, but it's going to be food. I can tell you that. So one is that we can change these biomes to make them address questions that are more important than whatever they were trying to address at the time. And what was the other thing that was important? Oh, and the other important thing is that you can actually write proposals to like the National Science Foundation where they understand that it's yours. I mean, you're not going to, that this thing has longevity, it has sustainability. So that at the beginning, when we took over the biosphere for the first 4 years, we were also leasing it. And that was by joint agreement, right? Because we didn't know we were getting a pig in a poke or what. And Ed didn't want to sort of let go of it either. So for the first few years, we were leasing it. And about 6 years ago or something like that, it was fully donated to the University of Arizona. So, and at the beginning, the other interesting thing about the biosphere is that when the university first took over the biosphere 10 years ago, I got the biosphere with $30 million to run it for 10 years. which is what we all thought it would take to run it. And in the end, we were off by a chunk of money because the Landscape Evolution Observatory on its own was $5 million, which we borrowed from the University of Arizona to build it. So the university had a very schizophrenic view of the biosphere first, because if it was really a bad thing, they didn't want to have the brand of the biosphere of the university sort of besmirched by the biosphere. But at the same time, they could see that this was sort of something cool. But now, with the new president, he came in and he stared at the biosphere for about 3 nanoseconds, and he said, all universities in this country are looking for differentiators. How do they differentiate from somebody else? Caltech doesn't have one of these things. MIT doesn't have one of these things. This is absolutely terrific. So the first thing that happened when he said that is that all of a sudden, the $5 million loan was forgiven. And now they're paying for the electricity. And now they're paying for postdocs. And I was able to go back to Ed and get a $30 million endowment. So then all of a sudden, this thing has legs forever. But it took somebody like that to say, I was talking to the mirror. And before that, it was actually way more complicated.
Hi.
Hi.
I have a question about Leo at the Biosphere 2.
Yeah.
So as I understand it, you're using one particular kind of soil that you got from Flagstaff.
It's not even soil, it's rock.
Okay, rock.
Yeah,
Just one
it's a basalt.
specific kind of, okay, basalt rock. How applicable is that towards other kinds of rock or soil to the same kind of mechanism of the hydraulics? I mean, I could see how this experiment could prove, okay, with this particular kind of rock, under these kind of conditions, this will happen. But how can you ensure that other rocks or other soils would have, the same thing would happen to?
Well, that's a terrific question. So like any experiment, you actually have to be pragmatic about it. The reason that basalt was chosen is because basalt is the easiest rock to actually weather. Okay, so you put a basalt sort of surface on it, you'll create soil out of the basalt faster than you would create it if you had any other kind of rock. So and the reactions that you have with the minerals inside of basalt are reactions that occur way faster than if you have a granite or an andesite or whatever you want to call it. But what's going to be, so the chemistry that happens would be different if there's another kind of rock. You're right. And how you produce the soil would be different if you had a different kind of a rock. But since we all want to be alive by the time this thing ends, basalt was sort of what drove basalt. But that should not influence the hydrology, because the hydrology is mostly going to be driven by how water moves around the subsurface, and that's through cracks, not through the chemistry that is happening because of weather. So I think the hydrology is going to be okay. What's going to really change the hydrology is when you actually have plants, way more than if you actually had a different kind of a rock. But you're right. I mean, like anything else, it's an experiment that's limited by the conditions that you started with.
Oh, sorry. So the interaction you were talking about with the CO2, that would be different with.
It would completely be different. So if we would have watered a field that was rhyolite, it wouldn't have sucked up any of the any CO2. That's correct.
My turn. So I wanted to go back for just a second for the selection of biomes. And maybe there was something predictive about having the desert biome there, because we're all going to end up that way. Just kidding. I wanted to ask you about the basalt and the turning into soil, which will support plant life. I'm sure you're familiar with the experiment that was carried out on a very small scale by Dragos, I'm blocking on his last name, who was a postdoc at the facility at Biosphere 2, and showed that bacteria basically are the ones that converted. Do you see that going into a large scale through the Leo?
Well, Jos may have more information on this, but one of the things that we're hugely interested in is the evolution of the microbiome through time, right? So, and how that evolves. So of course, when we started with Leo already has a microbiome, which is very limited because it's this ground up basalt, but it's not sterile. But we know what it is, and the person that's sort of in charge of that is Raina Meyer, is one of the people that's looking at that kind of stuff. But clearly, the evolution of the microbiome is huge. It's really important. I am so upset that somebody did not do an analysis of the microbiome 25 years ago, right? In the rainforest, and compare it to today. That would be absolutely terrific. But nobody did that because nobody really cared about them. Well, they did, but they didn't. But yeah, we're paying a whole lot of attention to that.
I got a question. I live in Tempe, and all the time I have to listen to ASU's School of Sustainability, how wonderful it is and stuff like that. But, you know, the Biosphere is the most recognizable sustainability experiment in the world, probably. Mm-hmm. And it seems fine that, you know, you have all these plans for Biosphere that they're all great. Mm-hmm. But it could be so much more with, you know, it's like a brick and mortar store versus Amazon. Mm-hmm. You know, if you can change the program to include reaching out globally mm-hmm. To these things.
Yep. We have great partnerships with the French, with Challeneges, and they have these places that they, where these things that look like Winnebagos, which are highly controlled systems, actually for food production and other stuff. So we have great partnerships with them, and we have very difficult partnerships or zero partnerships with ASU. We have great partnerships with Mexico. In fact, just a deep sort of thing, when Colombia left the Biosphere, Ed Bass asked the National Academy of Sciences to create a town hall in Washington to ask the question, is the Biosphere have a future? What's the role of the Biosphere in environmental research? And if there was none, I guess he was going to tear it down. And that's when I got involved. That's where I met all these people. I was a representative from the UofA to this town hall. And the representative from ASU was their vice president for research. He's left since, a guy named Fink, who I know because he's a geologist. And after 2 days of rattling around in which everybody said this is the greatest thing since sliced bread, but the DOE didn't want to make it a lab. NSF didn't want to put any money into it to make it a lab. The idea was then that this could become a state lab, right? And that ASU and the U of A would run it. And when I got back to my office, they never would even answer my phone calls. And of course, the reason they never wanted to answer my phone calls is because they were trying to get it for themselves. And so whatever they did, they pissed off Ed Bass, and he wasn't interested. But it's very difficult to partner with them. And I really have good friends up there.
Yeah, well, what I envision is that it's a brand.
Yeah.
That all the other parts of UofA could
absolutely. Yeah, I agree with that. And that's what we're trying to do.
Not have everything done up there.
Yeah. We did some very simple thing at the U of A when President Robbins came in, which I think is going to move very quickly to do what you're suggesting. It was I mean, this just goes into, you know, structures and architecture of organizations, but the Biosphere was a department in the College of Science, and we've just moved it so that it is now underneath the Vice President for Research, right? So now it's an institutional laboratory, just like Bio5 or any of the other ones, and then all of a sudden it becomes way easier to partner with my fellow deans. It's just weird, but that's what it is. Yeah. Somebody beat you to it. Sorry.
Well, I have a question about the basalt and the basalt bed, which I saw when it was first installed. And I have two questions. When you plant that, after you've experimented with the hydrology, et cetera, that's going on now, was the basalt sterilized before?
No.
No, it wasn't.
No.
So you brought in whatever bacteria is in
Correct.
there, it was in there from its native habitat.
Right.
So when you plant plants in there, how do you intend to use organic materials to fertilize it? Do you tend to use chemical fertilizers, etc.?
So no, we're never going. I don't think we're ever going to use chemical fertilizers. But they're doing experiments in buckets now to see what kinds of plants actually can grow just in the natural conditions of the basalt. So that the idea is just to let stuff grow there on its own, and to see. Nothing is growing in the in Leo, is there? Oh. Probably be full of buffalo grass before we know it. No, and then I'm going to have to run.
Just to talk about the desert biome a little bit. I spent 5 years with Carl Hodges and Merle at the Environmental Research Lab, and ERL was all about food production in coastal deserts. So that was one reason to include the desert as a biome. Also, the thing mentioned before about desertification happening globally, they felt that it was important to have that as one of the components of the biosphere.
Well, thank you.
Just to clear that up.
Okay. Thank you very much.
We need to do some questions from online real quick. We've got some from Neil, who is part of our team over here, but he asked, with the water in B2, is it treated, or do the plants handle it all naturally?
The water is it's only, well, there's labeled water. We have water with deuterium in it. So, but it's not cleaned. It's not treated, but it is spiked with various kinds of isotopes and elements, so that we can trace where the water is coming from.
Okay. Is it recycled?
No,
okay.
Because for the same reason, because since it's all labeled, we can't recycle it anymore.
Okay. And then a second one on here is just about the UVA and the UVB. Could the UVA and the UVB be added with artificial lighting, or would that be too expensive?
Well, I think we're going to have to do experiments where we're interested in that kind of stuff with LEDs. I mean, we can't sort of change the structure of the thing or the glass. So it's going to be special lighting in special areas where we're interested in that as well. Yeah.
About 4 years ago, when we had guests here who, the gentleman was from Kurdistan, and he got his law degree at the Rogers College, and his wife is an OBGYN doctor. And this is after the very major military encounter in Iraq. The area there, they came here as guests. They learned about greenhouses, and their mother back in Kurdistan set up a greenhouse, and it's productive. The point here is that at the moment, about 25% of the population of Lebanon is camps of displaced people. And we have a superb hookup here in terms of telemedicine and teleeducation. And both the United Nations and with John Hildebrand and the relationship we have with the National Science Foundation and the various other foundations, there is a world concern. Can we develop modes of education based perhaps here that provide something that serves as a model for the entire world for displaced people to learn, such they can easily transport it back to their nation of origin, with the fact that they have a cessation of military encounter. We're doing this at the moment in a small scale in Afghanistan, in the province of Herat, and certainly that could be expanded.
No comment?
Well, I think it's a great idea. I mean, one of the things we're thinking, I hadn't thought about the displaced people, but certainly I've been thinking of term smart village, right? So you can actually go to places that don't have much water or electricity or food safety and security, and bring in a bunch of stuff to make these people better. And we actually wrote with Gary Nabham a proposal to the MacArthur Fellow, to the MacArthur organization, on that view. And when you get into that, you also need to have an army of social scientists, because if not, you just show up with a pile of equipment that nobody will take out of the box. No, that's right. But I agree with you, and I'm thank you for bringing up the idea of this displaced people. That's a big deal. Yeah.
I think it's clear from all the questions that you presented us with lots and lots of things to think about, lots of things that we learned about ourselves at the university here, and fantastic presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, and thank you, and I do welcome any interest and any ideas. And if anybody wants to visit the Biosphere because you haven't been there in a long time, I'd be happy to show you and talk about what it could be. Thank you. Thank you so much. That was really